Series of videos will look at the history of American medicine, disease, and healthcare. In this first one, we'll focus on the colonial era and Native Americans. Many Native Americans were animists, and they saw spirits in nature. Disturbing nature more than necessary risked angering the spirits, who could turn around and hurt you. Challenges, such as an epidemic of some disease, was often interpreted as a result of the spiritual world being angered. A medicine man, therefore, had religious and medical knowledge and performed the functions of both a priest and a physician. It's a very important figure in Native American culture. Eastern Woodlands Indians, they smoked tobacco, as you know, and they believed it had medicinal as well as social benefits. Turning to the colonists, their journey across the Atlantic were fraught with the risk of disease. The ships were small and crowded, and any sickness brought aboard would spread rapidly. Moreover, the lack of adequate food was often a threat to health. Scurvy, for example, which caused things like bleeding gums and wounds that would not heal, was common because of a lack of vitamin C from fresh fruits. The Columbian Exchange, of course, had a profound impact on Native American health, as Native Americans had not been exposed to European diseases and lacked the immunity the Europeans had. One of the most notable diseases was smallpox, which was prevalent in Europe but not in North America. In the early 17th century, Puritans believed that the deadly epidemic of smallpox among the nearby Massachusetts Native Americans was God clearing the land of religious heathens for their godly settlements. Other diseases that the Europeans brought to America were tuberculosis, cholera, scarlet fever, diphtheria, and whooping cough. Measles and chickenpox were seldom fatal in Europe, but they proved deadly in North America. For a while, scholars believed that Native Americans gave syphilis to the Europeans, as there were documented outbreaks of sexually transmitted diseases in European port cities in the late 1400s and early 1500s. Today, however, most scholars believe that syphilis was already in Europe. Rats and other rodents which carried many diseases were inadvertently brought to America on ships. That's why many ships often had cats aboard to protect food supplies and to get rid of the disease-carrying rats and mice. Medicine was quite rudimentary for the early colonists who landed in the New World, primarily because very few upper-class doctors immigrated to the colonies. Women played a major role in administering care in these early days, most especially when it came to childbirth. Babies, of course, were delivered at home, and in fact, so-called midwives continued to deliver babies well into the 20th century. Giving birth was a dangerous endeavor, and death in childbirth was common. In other respects as well, mortality in the 17th century was extremely high, most notably for infants and small children. Malaria was particularly brutal, as was diphtheria and yellow fever. Most of the sick were treated with folk remedies and prayer. Many 17th century colonists still believed that illness was a product of God's wrath. This began to change with the spread of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. The Enlightenment suggested that natural laws established by God governed the world, and disease would be one of these natural laws, and you could study nature and natural laws and work them to your advantage. Here you see a picture of a hot air balloon that they were testing in the Enlightenment era in Europe. Still, discovering the natural laws that governed health remained really primitive. Many colonial Americans believed that illness was caused by an imbalance in the body between heat and coldness, or dryness and wetness. Here you can see on the top right a so-called doctor getting ready to apply some hot or cold compresses to this woman. Advances in medicine remained difficult. Many scientists wanted to examine the dead to learn about the body, but often the public resisted it. In Europe, for example, some scientists resorted to secretly digging up the newly dead from graveyards. A common remedy well into the 18th century remained bleeding a patient, allowing the illness in blood, they believed, to leave the body. Leeches were commonly applied to drain the body of bad blood. The Enlightenment had a profound impact as so-called doctors combined folk remedies that had suggested efficacy with newly empirically based observational research. Here you can see a doctor's office there on the bottom left. Throughout the colonial era, government gave healthcare little attention and there remained few regulations. Doctors began, however, to coordinate not only their growing knowledge, but also to weed out bad practitioners or to get rid of unhelpful treatments. The first medical society was formed in Boston in 1735. One of the few early colonial regulations was requiring sick arrivals to quarantine in so-called pest houses. These pest houses existed as early as 1717 in Boston and also operated in port cities of New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. The doctors, of course, didn't understand the concept of germs, but experience had taught them that sickness spread from the sick to the healthy when they encountered each other. The earliest hospitals as such were in New Orleans. The Royal Hospital, founded in 1722 as a military infirmary, grew to serve the public when the Ursuline Sisters of the Catholic Church took over its operation. The Charity Hospital, which opened in 1736, was operated by many of the same people and served the poor people unable to attend the Royal Hospital. Here you can see a picture on the right of the early Charity Hospital. It's not the one that was there in the colonial times. You can see some electrical wires, but it's an early version of a hospital that still exists. By this time, the idea of inoculation had spread from Europe to America, supported by the practice of slaves who had a form of it from West African traditions. They had learned, for example, with smallpox, that if you cut somebody in their arm and take a little pus from an infected person's smallpox outbreak and put it into the cut, the person who was cut would develop a mild version of disease, but afterwards would be immune. And so this was the earliest version of inoculation that people began to practice. Of course, the average folk was still very, very scared of it, understandably so. In 1750, the first large general hospital was opened in Philadelphia. The idea of a hospital, regardless, remained unattractive to many people because the care remained so primitive. The hospital appeared a place that people went to die. France, Scotland, and Germany led Enlightenment medical research, and some American doctors traveled to schools in Paris and Edinburgh to learn their craft. For example, in the 18th century, 118 Americans studied medicine in Edinburgh. Once back in America, they subsequently passed on what they'd learned. The first American medical college was the Medical College of Philadelphia, founded in 1765. And you can see an early version of that on the bottom left here. And that, of course, became what is now the University of Pennsylvania. 2 years later, in 1767, the medical department of King's College was established in New York, and that, of course, became Columbia University. And it was there in 1770, shown on the right bottom, that they granted the first American MD degree. The first American medical textbook appeared in 1775. This is not necessarily it on the first one on the bottom left, but it's a contemporaneous medical textbook there. And 3 years after that first medical textbook in America, 1778, you had the first book of pharmacology was published, a book summarizing all the drugs that they knew of. Now, a major advance in healthcare was Benjamin Franklin's invention of bifocals in 1784. Franklin was famous as America's leading Enlightenment figure. You can see his concept design on the left and the actual glasses on the right. This concludes the first video focusing primarily on the colonial era.